The first thing Dr. Kale Morrow noticed about the Vihari was that they never blinked. Not once. Not in the 16 months since their vessels had to descend through the cloud layer above New Geneva, like iron mountains deciding to fall. Not in any of the briefing, the negotiations, the quiet demonstrations of force that the Vihari called educational events, and the UN translation Corps had the professional decency to render as something less honest. Their eyes, three to a face, arranged in a shallow arc, were the color of frozen seawater, and they moved with the slow, deliberate tracking of something that had evolved to watch prey from very far away. They processed everything. They forgot nothing. And in 16 months of occupation, not one of them had blinked. Kale had started noticing things like that. It was an occupational hazard. He had spent 11 years before first contact running cognitive stress trials for the ESA, measuring how much pressure a human mind could absorb before the load-bearing structures gave way. Pain tolerance, sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, the quiet erosion of identity under sustained psychological assault. He had mapped the edges of endurance with the clinical precision of a cartographer, and what he had found, consistently and without exception, was that humans were stranger than anyone had given them credit for. The breaking point kept moving. The mind kept adapting. People who should have shattered walked out of the deprivation chambers humming to themselves, blinking in the fluorescent light, asking if there was coffee. He had written 3 papers on the subject. The Vihari had rendered them obsolete in 16 months. "You're doing it again," said Dr. Senamar from across the long conference table. "Doing what?" "Watching Counselor Veth like he's a lab rat." "He is a lab rat," Kale said quietly, not looking away from the Vihari delegate at the far end of the room. "We all are. That's the point of these sessions." Senna followed his gaze. Counselor Veth stood at the environmental display, one hand, four-fingered, jointless, capable of exerting roughly 900 pounds of pressure per square centimeter, resting flat against the holographic surface as he reviewed the atmospheric compliance data. He wore the standard diplomatic harness, a lattice of dark carbon fiber over iridescent skin, embedded with the translation membrane that rendered his subsonic vocalizations into something close enough to English to be dangerous. He was, by the Vihari's own admission, the least powerful individual in their command structure. A bureaucrat, a functionary, and yet every human in the room sat very still when he moved. "The session starts in 4 minutes, Senna said. "You should eat something." I ate. "A protein bar at 6 this morning doesn't count." "It counts." She pushed a wrapped sandwich across the table without looking at him. He ate it without tasting it, still watching Veth, and thought about the centrifuge. The centrifuge had been Dr. Oren Hallam's idea. Hallam was the committee's biometrics lead, a small, rumpled man with the permanent expression of someone who had just remembered something important and couldn't recall what it was. He had come to Kale 3 weeks ago with a data chip and a request to meet somewhere the building's monitoring systems didn't reach, which in the current administrative climate meant the parking structure on sublevel 4, standing between 2 electric cargo vehicles, with the engines running to defeat the acoustic sensors. "They're reading us," Hallam had said. What ramble? "Everyone reads everyone," Kale had said. "That's governance now. Not everyone. Not like this." Hallam had pressed the chip into Kale's hand. "The Vihari translation membrane isn't just a language tool, Kale. I've been running the spectral data from our last 6 sessions. Every time one of our delegates makes a decision, not announces it, makes it, at the neurological level, there's a corresponding activation spike in the membrane. Before they speak, before they move, they're reading our cognitive state in real time. They know what we're going to say before we say it." Kale had stared at the chip. "That's not possible. The membrane operates on acoustic. The membrane operates on everything. Acoustic is just what they want us to see." Hallam had looked for a moment, genuinely frightened. "I ran it through the centrifuge telemetry as a control. You know what happens to the readings when one of our people is under high rotational stress. The spike pattern changes, completely. They can't read us when our nervous system is under that kind of load. It's like static, white noise to them." "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying there might be a way to think in a room full of Vihari without them knowing what you're thinking. And I'm saying that whoever figures out how to do that systematically is going to be very important to the survival of this species. And I'm saying you should look at the data before someone figures out that I pulled it." He had been dead within the week. The official cause was cardiac arrest. He had been found slumped in his office chair, the centrifuge running at maximum load in the lab next door. a fact the Vahari liaison officer had noted in the incident report, with the polite curiosity of someone who found the timing interesting, but not, of course, significant. Kale had looked at the data. He had not told anyone. That was the first rule he had set for himself, and the most important, and the hardest. He had not told Senna, who was the person in the world he most trusted. He had not told Director Voss, who ran the committee and had the kind of blunt institutional courage that Kale respected, and in the current moment feared would get him killed. He had not told his sister back in Reykjavik, who sent him voice messages every few days, asking if he was sleeping and if he was eating, and if he was seeing anyone, in that order, because she worried about him in that order. He had told no one because Hallam had told him, and Hallam was dead. Instead, he had spent 3 weeks building a map. Not a map of the Vahari. There was precious little to map. Their biology was a closed system. Every attempt at tissue analysis had resulted in the samples degrading within hours of collection, as though they were designed to deny study. Their vessels were impenetrable. Their social structure, beyond the minimal hierarchy they showed the humans, was opaque. What Kale could map was the pattern of their attention, where they looked, what they logged, which human behaviors generated the longest observation windows. What seemed, and here was the word he kept snagging on, because it implied something he wasn't ready to commit to, what seemed to make them nervous. Patterns were what he had always done best. The centrifuge data was real. He had verified it 6 different ways, using equipment he had borrowed from 4 different departments, and returned before anyone noticed. When the human nervous system was under sufficient sustained stress, not acute panic, which the Vahari could apparently read with ease, but the grinding low-frequency load of chronic endurance pressure, the membrane spike pattern flattened. Whatever they were reading, they lost resolution. A human under that kind of load became, to the Vahari's biosensors, something like snow on an old television screen. Interesting, Kale had thought. Then he had thought, useful. Then he had spent 2 weeks not thinking about it at all, because thinking about it was exactly the kind of thing he could not afford to be caught doing. He had instead thought about very boring things, budget allocations, atmospheric compliance matrices, the particular dullness of institutional coffee. He had become, over those 2 weeks, the most aggressively unremarkable person in the building. He arrived at the same time each day, he ate at the same table, he reviewed the same documents in the same order. He had developed with considerable effort the interior life of a man who had already accepted defeat, because a man like that was very dull to watch. And the Vahari, like all apex predators, found dull things uninteresting. He had also quietly begun talking to people. The committee had 9 members. 3 were functionally compromised, not through collaboration, but through fear, which was worse, because fear was unpredictable. 2 had already been replaced by Vahari-approved substitutes, which was the diplomatic term for individuals whose neurological profiles had been, in Hallam's phrase, adjusted. That left 4. Senamar cognitive systems, who had the specific kind of stubbornness that looked like competence from outside, and was actually something closer to an inability to accept a situation as permanent. She collected small objects, a bottle cap, a bent coin, a piece of sea glass, and kept them in her left coat pocket, and when she was working through a problem, she sorted them by touch without knowing she was doing it. Dr. Piotr Vasek, physiological metrics, who had been a long-distance runner before the commission had recruited him, and still ran 15 kilometers before dawn every morning, with the expression of someone who understood that pain was a language, and had become fluent. He drank terrible coffee with apparent enjoyment. He had once, during a 12-hour deprivation trial, sung folk songs from his grandmother's village in a low, continuous monotone for 6 hours to anchor himself, and had emerged from the trial with his cognitive metrics nearly undegraded. Dr. Amara Nyong, environmental systems, who had grown up in a part of the world that had been slowly becoming uninhabitable for 2 decades before the Vahari arrived, and who therefore had a particular perspective on the concept of catastrophe that the rest of the committee, having come from more comfortable circumstances, occasionally lacked. She was the one who had first noticed that the Vahari atmospheric compliance data contained a systematic rounding error in the oxygen depletion projections. She had not reported it. She had written it in a personal notebook, in a private shorthand, and said nothing, because she, too, had been learning to be boring. And there was Kale himself, who was perhaps the least interesting person in any room he entered, and who was, as of 3 weeks ago, the most dangerous. He had approached each of them the way you approach a fire you are not sure is safe. Obliquely, from a distance, testing the temperature with questions that could be interpreted as idle curiosity. Academic chat, water cooler non-events. He had not said, "I know what Hallam found." He had not said, "I think we can fight back." He had said things like, "Did you notice the response time on the membrane yesterday when Vasek was talking? And I've been thinking about the old stress tolerance work, wondering if any of it still has applications." And once, standing in the narrow kitchen alcove with Amara while the coffee machine ran, "You used to work in atmospheric pressure research, didn't you? High-altitude stuff?" She had looked at him for a long moment with dark, careful eyes. "Yes," she had said. "I've been trying to remember who wrote the endurance modeling paper from that program, the one about cognitive load under chronic physiological stress." Another pause. The coffee machine hissed. "I think that was Hallam," she said. "Right," he said. "Hallam." He poured his coffee. "Shame about him." "Yes," she said. "A shame." She had found him after the afternoon session with her notebook open to a page that showed, in her private shorthand, a systematic breakdown of the oxygen depletion rounding error, and beneath it, in neat columns, what the actual numbers implied about the Vihari's timeline. They were not here for indefinite occupation. They had a window, and the window was much shorter than anyone had been told. They met in the parking structure on sublevel 4, engines running. Kale laid it out the way he would have laid out a research proposal. Problem, methodology, hypothesis, projected outcomes, and watched his three colleagues absorb it with the particular stillness of people who have been waiting for someone to say the thing they have been thinking, and were afraid to say themselves. "The membrane reads neurological coherence," he said. "Organized thought. What they can't parse is high-load incoherence. Not chaos, but the kind of sustained cognitive noise generated by extreme physiological stress. Hallam proved it in the centrifuge data. When the nervous system is running at maximum endurance load, the signal degrades. So what? Vasek said.
Run marathons in the negotiation room?
Not exactly, but close. Kale pulled out his own notebook. The stress load doesn't have to be physical. Any sustained high-frequency neurological demand degrades the signal. Mental arithmetic at speed. Competing auditory input. Chronic pain modulation, not acute chronic. The kind of thing you can sit in a chair and do without anyone seeing it. Senna was already sorting her pocket objects. "You're describing a way to think without them reading it." "I'm describing a way to plan without them knowing we're planning." "That's insane," Vasek said, without any particular heat. "Yes," Kale said. "What's the plan?" Amara asked. The plan, in its first form, was simple enough to be almost insulting. It had three components. The first was the oxygen data. Amara had established that the Vihari atmospheric timeline was not the open-ended administrative process they had represented in every diplomatic session to date. The actual projections, corrected for the rounding error, gave a hard endpoint of somewhere between 8 and 11 months. After that point, the nitrogen-oxygen ratio in the lower atmosphere would have shifted past the threshold required for Vihari metabolic function. They would have to leave or adapt, and nothing in their biology suggested they could adapt. They were running out of time on a planet they had occupied with the confidence of something that had never encountered a deadline before. This was information. Information was leverage, but only if you knew when and how to use it. The second component was the membrane. Specifically, the translation membrane's deep dependency on neurological coherence meant that any significant cognitive disruption to a Vihari delegate during a critical negotiation session could, in principle, produce translation errors. Not dramatic failures, small ones. The kind that could be introduced gradually and plausibly deniably into a series of diplomatic documents. Shifts in the technical language of the atmospheric compliance agreements that, when read in the context of the actual depletion data, would commit the Vihari command structure to a withdrawal timeline they had not intended to agree to. It was, Kale acknowledged to himself, the most elaborate piece of paperwork in human history. The third component was Kale, because Hallam's data, when he had reviewed it a final time with fresh eyes and the particular clarity that comes from spending 3 weeks being deliberately boring, had shown him something he had not expected to find. Something that even Hallam, who had been very smart and very careful and very dead, had apparently missed or had not lived long enough to act on. Kale's own membrane response profile was different from anyone else's on the committee, not in degree, in kind. Where the others showed the characteristic flattening under cognitive load, the static, the white noise, Kale's profile showed something else. The signal didn't degrade, it inverted. Under maximum endurance load, his neurological output didn't become noise. It became something that looked, in the spectral data, remarkably like a Vihari membrane emission. He had spent 3 days deciding what that meant. He had spent another 3 days deciding whether to tell anyone. He had in the end told no one. He had instead spent a week learning to control it. The committee session began at 9. Councillor Veth opened with the standard atmospheric compliance review. His membrane rendering his subsonic vocalizations into something smooth and institutional and faintly condescending in the way that a structure built over your home is faintly condescending. He noted the quarter's compliance rates. He noted areas for improvement. He did not note the rounding error in the oxygen depletion projections, because the Vihari had not corrected it in the document submitted to the Human Committee, which told Kale everything he needed to know about what the Vihari thought the Human Committee was capable of. He sat quietly and ran prime numbers, not out loud, not visibly. Just behind his eyes, at speed he had trained himself to reach over 3 weeks of practice in sub-level 4 with the engines running, a continuous mental process that the Vihari membrane, if Hallam's data was right, would read as nothing. Snow. Interference, a man so unremarkable that looking at him was like looking at furniture. He needed to be invisible for the next 40 minutes. After that, he was going to need to be something else entirely. Synapsana present cognitive load data, their standard quarterly report, numbers arranged with such careful artlessness that only someone who had read 300 cognitive load reports would notice the particular artlessness was deliberate. She ran a long division problem in her head while she spoke, and he could see from the slight asymmetry in her expression. A professional reading, the kind you developed after 11 years of running cognitive trials, that she was managing the load well. Vasek had hands flat on the table, maintaining something in his own interior landscape that required his jaw to be slightly tighter than usual. Amara spoke without notes, which was how she always worked, and her eyes had the particular blankness of someone reading text only they could see. Councillor Veth observed all of it, with his 3 frozen sea eyes and his absolute unbroken attention and his complete confidence that he understood everything in the room. 40 minutes in, Amara presented the atmospheric compliance projection for the coming year. She presented it using the Vihari's own numbers, corrected for the rounding error. There was a pause. Councillor Veth's membrane emitted 3 seconds of subsonic vocalization before translating. This data it rendered does not match the Commission's own projections. No, Amarsa said pleasantly. There seems to have been a rounding error in the Commission's submitted data. We've corrected it. Another pause, longer. The correction is noted, Veth said. We will review. We've also, Kale said, quietly, from the middle of the table, not looking up from his own documents, taken the liberty of incorporating the corrected figures into the atmospheric compliance language of the next quarter agreement. The relevant paragraphs are highlighted. The room was very still. Veth's eyes moved to him. All 3, tracking slowly, with the deliberate attention of something that had evolved to watch from very far away. Kale ran prime numbers and looked back. This language, Veth's membrane said, after a moment that had the quality of something very large deciding how to move, commits the Commission to a specific operational timeline. It reflects the actual atmospheric data, Kale said. We assumed that was what you wanted. Another 3 seconds of subsonic. The membrane translated them as, we will need to review this language. Of course, Kale said. We've also copied the relevant documents to the UN Oversight Committee, as per standard disclosure protocol. The briefest pause. Standard protocol does not require. It does under the revised administrative agreement, Senna said from across the table. She set a document in front of her without looking at it. Section 14, paragraph 3. We updated the language last quarter. The Commission's liaison signed off on it. This was true. The liaison had signed off on it. The liaison had signed off on a great many things over the previous 3 months, because the revision to Section 14 had been prepared by Amara and buried inside 17 pages of atmospheric technical language at a point in the document where human attention typically degraded, which they had determined through their own cognitive load research. And no one, human or Vihari, had flagged it. The Vihari had been so confident they were reading the room that they had stopped reading the documents. The session ended without incident. This was in its way more alarming than the alternative. A Vihari council that reacted with visible anger was a council that was telling you where the pressure points were. A council that said nothing and ended the session early and withdrew with the smooth, terrible efficiency of something recalibrating. That was a council that was going to respond in a way you could not anticipate. Cale stayed at the table after the others had gone, ostensibly reviewing documents. He ran prime numbers and waited. The attack when it came was not what he had expected. It never was. He was in the parking structure on sub-level 3, one level above their usual meeting place, which was apparently not as unmonitored as they had believed. When the walk-don't-walk panel above the elevator bank began cycling at a frequency that had nothing to do with pedestrian traffic, he recognized it, in the way you recognize a sound you've never heard before but somehow know is wrong, as a Vihari membrane signal amplified and directed, not subsonic neurological targeted. The effect was immediate and almost beautiful in its specificity, a sudden absolute certainty that his identity was wrong, not that he was in danger, not fear, something quieter and more precise. The sense that the self he understood himself to be was a construction con, and the construction was dissolving. He was not Cale Morrow. He was not a researcher. He had not been employed by the ESA. He had not run 11 years of cognitive stress trials. The documentation said otherwise, but the documentation was wrong, and he would find, if she checked, that the records had been corrected. It was, he thought, with the part of his mind that was still running prime numbers, extraordinarily good work. He sat down on the parking structure floor and ran prime numbers faster. The Vihari had used this technique before, the progressive erasure. They called it in the incident reports, the administrative dissolution of a problem. You did not eliminate the individual, you eliminated the individual's context. His academic record gone, his employment history revised, the police with a list of discrepancies. The people around him suddenly uncertain whether they had ever actually known him, because the membrane, applied at the right frequency, could reach further than a single room. It could reach outward. It could reach the people who answered phones and filed records and issued credentials. It could reach, with enough time and enough signal, the entire institutional architecture of a human life. He had prepared for this. He had prepared for this with the same systematic thoroughness with which he had prepared everything else, because 11 years of cognitive stress research had taught him one thing above all others. You did not wait to find out what your breaking point was. You found it in a controlled environment first, and then you knew where it was, and then you could approach it without fear. He had spent 2 weeks, during the boring period, dissolving himself deliberately. Every credential he had duplicated and placed in locations the Vihari's administrative axis would not reach. Physical paper, in physical locations, held by people who had no connection to the committee and no digital footprint. Every relationship he valued, he had reinforced through non-digital contact. Every piece of institutional evidence that he existed, he had backed up in media that required a human hand and a physical location to access. He had made himself, in the Vihari's administrative architecture, as erasable as they wanted. He had also made himself, outside that architecture, completely indelible. And he had given copies of everything, the centrifuge data, the oxygen projections, the membrane analysis, the revised Section 14, all of it, to 7 people in 7 cities, with instructions to release it to every remaining independent media outlet if they did not hear from him by a specific date. The membrane signal pulsed again. He felt his name go uncertain at the edges. He ran prime numbers and thought about his sister in Reykjavik, who worried about him sleeping and eating and seeing someone. He thought about the protein bar he had not eaten for breakfast, and the sandwich Senna had pushed across the table, which had been turkey, and which had been better than he had expected. He thought about Hallam, rumpled and frightened in the parking structure with the engines running, pressing a data chip into his hand. He thought about the centrifuge, which had killed Hallam with G-forces, that the human body simply could not sustain, and which had also, in doing so, given Hallam the last data point he had ever recorded. That at maximum load, the signal inverts. He thought, I know where my breaking point is. He thought, I have been past it before. He thought, this is well within tolerance. The membrane signal peaked. His name went entirely absent for a moment, just a gap, a white space where the self-concept usually was, and in that gap, in the silence of maximum cognitive load, he felt the inversion happen. Not dramatic, not a surge of power or a revelation of hidden ability, just a shift in frequency, small and precise, the way a key finds a lock in the dark by feel. His neurological output, under the sustained load he had been training toward for 3 weeks, matched the membrane emission profile he had spent 6 days memorizing from Hallam's spectral data. He could not read the Vihari's signal the way they read his. But he could, for approximately 40 seconds, produce something that looked enough like one of theirs to give the targeting system a fundamental problem. It was, in cognitive research terms, the most interesting piece of data he had ever generated. In the parking structure of sub-level 3, he directed it at the walk. "Don't walk" panel above the elevator bank, and the signal stopped. 40 seconds was enough. Not to win, he was clear-eyed about that. One man in a parking structure producing a mimetic membrane signal for 40 seconds was not a victory condition. It was a proof of concept, and the distinction mattered enormously, because what it meant was this. The Vihari's system of surveillance and control was not absolute. It had a mechanism. Mechanisms could be studied. Mechanisms could be disrupted, and a sufficiently distributed network of human nervous systems, each trained to the specific load parameters he had identified, each producing the inverted signal at coordinated intervals, could generate enough interference in the Vihari's membrane network to degrade their real-time cognitive intelligence across an entire city. He had not told his 3 colleagues about this part of the plan. He told them now, in the parking structure on sub-level 4, 20 minutes later, with the engines running, and Senna's pocket objects sorted by touch, and Vasek's jaw set, and Amara's notebook open to a new page. He told them because Hallam had told him, alone, and that had not worked out well for Hallam. He had spent 3 weeks being so careful to share nothing that he had almost made the opposite mistake. The one where caution becomes a kind of isolation, and isolation becomes a vulnerability, and the thing that is trying to unmake you succeeds not because it is stronger, but because you have made yourself smaller and smaller in the service of surviving. Humans, he had written in one of his papers, do not survive through isolation. The data is consistent across all parameters and all durations. The individuals who walk out of the deprivation chambers with their cognitive metrics intact are not the ones who endured alone. They are the ones who built something to hold on to inside the silence. A memory, a person, a song. The thing that keeps the self coherent is not the self's own strength. It is the self's knowledge that the self is witnessed. Senna listened without interrupting. She sorted her pocket objects, bottle cap, bent coin, sea glass, something small and smooth he couldn't identify. When he finished, she said, "How many people would we need to train? For a single city? Maybe 100. For enough coverage to matter." He paused. "More. How long to train them?" "To the basic load parameters. 3 weeks. I did it in 3, she nodded slowly. "And the Vihari will know something happened in that parking structure." "Yes. So we have, what? A week before they move to shut this down? Maybe less." Vasses had his hands flat on the table again. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about something. The first session I ever ran before I came to the committee. High-altitude acclimatization study. Man named Bergthorson, Icelandic, built like a wall, did not speak at all for the first 4 days. I thought he was going to be the first washout. Day 5, he starts talking. Doesn't stop for the rest of the study. You know what he talked about?" "What?" Amara said. "His mother's kitchen. The specific smell of it. The way the light came through the window in the afternoon." Vasek picked up his coffee cup, looked at it, set it down. He said that when the load was worse, that's what he held on to. Not an abstract idea, not a plan. "One specific room." A pause. "I have one specific room," Amara said quietly. "If that helps, it helps," Kale said. They had 6 days. He knew it was 6, because on the morning of the 7th, the administrative dissolution would become impossible to contain. The documents he had placed would begin surfacing, and the Vihari's priority would shift from quiet control to something louder and less predictable. And a louder, less predictable Vihari response was, paradoxically, less dangerous than the quiet kind. The thing you could see coming was not the thing that killed you. 6 days was enough. Not comfortable. Hallam's data had required 3 weeks to fully verify, and Kale was proposing to compress significant pieces of that process. But enough, in the specific sense that enough sometimes means barely, if everything goes right, and some things will not go right, and you will have to improvise. And you have been training for improvisation your whole career without knowing it. The first day was outreach, not digital. Kale had not used a network device for personal communication in 3 weeks, and he was not going to start now. He walked. He took the long routes through the parts of New Geneva that the Vihari liaison called non-priority zones, which meant the parts where the monitoring was thinner because the resources to monitor everywhere were, apparently, finite even for an interstellar administration. He knocked on doors, he sat in kitchens. He said things like, "I need 40 minutes of your time, and I can't explain why over anything with a signal. People said yes. Not everyone. Enough. The word he kept coming back to, explaining the training, the cognitive load parameters, the prime number sequences, the sustained endurance threshold, was boring. I need you to learn something boring. I need you to practice it until it is automatic. I need you to be able to do it while talking about the weather and while sitting in a committee session and while eating lunch. And I need you to be able to do it without anyone being able to tell you are doing it. And the good news is that the thing itself is so unremarkable that no one will think to look. Some of the people he sat with in those kitchens had never done anything like this before. Retired teachers, dock workers. A woman who ran a small bakery and whose hands, he noticed, never stopped moving, kneading invisible dough, reflexive and continuous, and who turned out to have the fastest acquisition rate of anyone he trained, because she had been doing sustained high-load motor cognitive tasks for 30 years, and her nervous system had been waiting, apparently, for someone to explain what it had been practicing for. He taught them the prime numbers. He taught them the load threshold. He taught them to feel the specific quality of noise that the load produced, and to hold it, and to keep holding it, past the point where the mind wanted to let go, and then a little further, and then a little further than that. He taught them the one thing that Hallam's data suggested, and his own 3 weeks had confirmed, that the human capacity for sustained cognitive load under pressure was not a fixed quantity. It was a skill, it could be trained. And in the training, something else happened. Something Hallam had not had time to document, but that Cale had been noticing since the 3rd week of his own practice, when the inversion had first appeared. Something that suggested the membrane was not the only direction in which this frequency could travel. He did not tell them that part yet. On the 4th day, Amara brought him the revised compliance documents. They were on paper unremarkable. The language was technical to the point of inducing productive boredom in anyone who read it, without the specific context to understand what the numbers meant. But the numbers, corrected again for the rounding error, and then written into the legal framework of the Atmospheric Compliance Agreement, with the particular precision of someone who had spent 20 years working in systems that had legal and atmospheric and human consequences, committed the Vihari Occupying Commission to a hard withdrawal date. Not a provisional date, not a subject to review date, a date. The date was 9 months out, which, by Amara's corrected projections, was 3 months before the atmospheric threshold crossed past metabolic viability for Vihari biology. They would have to leave before the deadline they had been committed to. There was no administrative mechanism by which the Vihari could then extend their occupation. Because the revised Section 14, which the liaison had signed, meant that any proposed extensions would have to pass through the UN Oversight Committee, which now included, as of an amendment filed 6 weeks ago by a junior administrator whose name no one in the Vihari liaison office had thought to flag. 3 of the 7 people holding Cale's document package. It was not, he thought, a victory, it was a structure. Structures required maintenance, and the Vihari would find every gap in it they could reach. And some of those gaps would cost people things they should not have to lose. But structures were how humans had survived every previous thing that had tried to unmake them. And this structure was more carefully built than any he had ever made. And it had been built by 4 people in a parking structure with the engines running. And then by 100 people in kitchens, and on long walking routes through non-priority zones. And then by all of them together, in sessions that looked, from the outside, like the most boring meetings in the history of the occupation. On the 6th day, the session began at 9. Councillor Veth opened with the standard compliance review. Cale had been told by 3 separate people who had been watching the monitoring data carefully, aware that something was wrong. The membrane readouts from the human committee members had been generating interference for 4 days. Degraded coherence, unclear resolution. The targeting data was coming in as noise, and the Vihari did not yet understand why, which meant, and this was the part that required precise timing, they were going to try to resolve it today. They were going to do it the way they had done it to Hallam. The direct application, maximum signal, the thing that had stopped a centrifuge and started a heart and erased a careful man from the world as cleanly as a hard drive wiped. Cale had arranged for there to be 114 people in the building, not in the conference room. They couldn't all fit. And a gathering that large would flag the monitoring before it could be useful. They were distributed across the building's offices and corridors and maintenance spaces, and the small staff kitchen on the 3rd floor, where the coffee machine hissed all day. Each of them doing something entirely ordinary while running prime numbers. The signal came at 40 minutes in. Not the walk don't walk panel this time. Something broader. Something that came through the walls. Through the building's own communication infrastructure, which the Vihari had integrated into their membrane network months ago, which they had done in plain sight because they had been so confident no one would understand what they were looking at. Kale felt it arrive. He held the load and let it wash over him, and thought about turkey sandwiches, and his sister in Reykjavik, and one specific room in Vasek's story. A kitchen, a window, afternoon light, and he ran prime numbers, and he felt the inversion happen. And around him, through the walls and through the floors, and through the small staff kitchen, where the coffee machine hissed, he felt 113 other human nervous systems do the same thing. Not simultaneously, not with mechanical precision. In the way that breathing spreads through a room, caught, passed on, held. The way a song starts with one voice, and a moment later has 10 and then has everyone. Not because anyone planned it, but because human beings, confronted with something to hold on to, hold on. The Vihari signal hit a wall of interference it had not been designed to encounter. The translation membrane, for the first time in 16 months of occupation, went quiet. Counselor Veth's face did not change. He did not blink. The frozen sea eyes did not shift. But his hands, those four-fingered, jointless hands capable of 900 pounds per square centimeter, went flat against the table in a way that was not administrative, not deliberate, the posture of something that has reached for a tool it has always had, and found the space where the tool used to be. Kale slid the compliance documents across the table. The revised atmospheric agreement, he said. We'd appreciate a signature at your earliest convenience. The Vihari did not leave quietly, and they did not leave gracefully, and they did not leave on the date in the document. They left 3 weeks later than the hard withdrawal date, which was still 6 weeks before the atmospheric threshold. Because the Vihari were not stupid, and their bureaucracy, however arrogant, was also responsive to data. The liaison officer, not Veth, who was recalled within days of the session, submitted the signed documents with a cover letter that the translation membrane rendered as compliance under current conditions is noted, which was, Kale thought, the most honest thing a Vihari official had ever said to a human. The day after they left, he sat in the parking structure on sub-level 4 for a long time with the engines off. The structure was very quiet. He had not eaten. Senna would be annoyed. And he was tired in the specific way that comes not from exertion, but from sustained vigilance finally released, the tension leaving a body that had forgotten what tension-free felt like. He thought about Hallam, the rumpled expression, the data chip pressed into his palm. He thought about the centrifuge running in the empty lab, and the record that said cardiac arrest, and the 3 papers Hallam had never lived to write. He pulled out his notebook and wrote on a fresh page, "The breaking point is not a ceiling, it is a door." Then he sat there in the quiet for a while and let himself be still. His phone, a physical one, purchased in cash 3 months ago, buzzed with a message from Reykjavik. "Are you sleeping?" his sister had written. "Are you eating? Are you seeing anyone?" He thought about the bakery, about invisible dough and hands that never stopped moving, and the fastest acquisition rate in his training cohort. He thought about a window in a kitchen, an afternoon light, wrote back, sleeping, eating, working on it. Outside, New Geneva was loud with the complicated, specific, graceless noise of a city remembering how to be itself. Not triumphant, not relieved, just present, a little raw. Humming at a frequency the Vihari had never been able to read, that they had spent 16 months trying to understand, and had left without understanding, because the frequency was not a signal. It was just people, talking, holding on, being witnessed. There was no clean translation for that. There never had been.